Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vittorian, and this is the 25th hour. And this week's news for the week of November 22nd to the 29th, 2020, New Yorkers are bracing for new COVID closures as Thanksgiving comes to an end. Cuomo heats up as the state bristles against COVID restrictions, and the Supreme Court delivers their pro-religious gathering ruling, and the walls are closing in on Trump after more states certify Biden's win, and courts continue to dismiss his cases. Now, on to the show. Things may have changed by the time you hear this, starting with Blasio. De Blasio's recent decisions about coronavirus closures are based on a 3% positivity rate threshold, but is continuously being undermined by the governor, who claims that the city is below the 3% threshold. The bodies of hundreds of people who died in the first COVID wave are still stored in freezer trucks because of difficulty locating the families of the dead. There was a secret Hasidic Jewish wedding on November 8th that was planned in secret and carried out with no one finding out, going against COVID rules, that had thousands of Jewish congregants jam into the wedding hall without any masks or social distancing. New York City issued a $15,000 fine against Yatsev Lev de Satmar that planned the wedding and sent a written warning against future indoor events. The city has encountered trouble trying to get the religious Jewish community to cooperate with COVID rules. The city sheriff's office has broken up a sex club in Queens with 80 people inside. A culture of underground parties have sprung up in the COVID age to bypass heavy restrictions. Staten Island has been marked in some places as an orange zone, with most of the island now under the COVID outbreak. The pandemic is also rewarding those with speedy internet connections, which usually falls down a racial divide. White affluent communities have better chances at business survival and schooling, unlike poor communities of color. New York City hospitals are running behind how much PPE they're legally required to stockpile, according to Greg Smith of the city, with the city and state not providing enough supplies at a fast rate. De Blasio had announced on Friday that the state acquired $900 million worth of PPE, but still coming up short in some supplies. An open field hospital was open in Staten Island, where South Beach Psychiatric Center is, as hospitals are bracing for more hospitalizations. There's one industry that has resumed its work during the pandemic, the TV industry, with the New York Times' Sharon Otterman reporting that shows like New Amsterdam and Blue Bloods have filmed largely undeterred despite not being back to its pre-pandemic shooting schedules. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade went off without a hitch, continuing its trend of still happening as scheduled no matter what the natural disaster is, such as a pandemic. City Sheriff Joseph Fucito said checkpoints for travelers are being set up to make sure they have negative test results before re-entering the city, facing $1,000 fines if they don't have those tests. The head of the New York City Teachers Union, Michael Mulgrew, has called for city control of schools to end, reverting authority back to the state government. City control of schools is set to end in 2 years, and de Blasio has strongly advocated for the city to have local control over its children's schooling. Before schools closed, the testing protocols for students were largely holding steady, with the city now wanting to expand those protocols so that kindergartners through 8th graders would be able to stay in school through a winter that many fear will make infections worse. The mayor said there will be more details of the city's reopening plans next week. New York City is mourning the death of its first black mayor, David Dinkins, who died at 93 years old of natural causes this week. Dinkins was the city's 106th mayor, serving between Ed Koch and Rudy Giuliani. Born in New Jersey, Dinkins served as a Marine in World War II, received his bachelor's from Howard University in D.C., his law degree from Brooklyn Law School, served as a state assemblyman, became Manhattan Borough president after 3 tries, before finally becoming the first black mayor of New York City. Promising to heal racial resentment in the city, calling the city's diversity a gorgeous mosaic, a confluence of socioeconomic factors ultimately led Dinkins only serve 1 term, including the boycott of a Korean deli in Flatbush, Brooklyn, the Crown Heights riots following the death of a black boy and a Hasidic Jewish scholar, blowback from Staten Island, which was entertaining a secession from the 5 boroughs, and a declining economy which brought in low tax revenue for the city. Dinkins actually grew the police force and oversaw lower crime numbers near the end of his tenure, cleaned up Times Square, brought in the National Tennis Center, and invested greatly into rehabilitating dilapidated housing. The mayor and other public officials are set to attend a memorial for the former mayor as of the time of this recording. An audit by Comptroller Scott Stringer revealed that the Department of Buildings has failed to follow up on more than half of immediately hazardous violations that were issued last year. Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams continued to hold fundraisers in questionable locations a day after having one inside a restaurant, this time in a club located in the Queens Yellow Zone. Adams has also called for delaying ranked choice voting, saying ranked choice voting will disenfranchise Black and Latino voters. To add salt to the wound, Michael Gartland from the New York Daily News reported on Adams' appearance at the 50th birthday of New York Building Congress Chair Carlos Cesura, which didn't have social distancing or mask wearing. Adams' campaign said he was at the party but in and out. Other mayoral candidates are treading cautiously on how they're fundraising following Adams' gaffes, with Scott Stringer pointing out his last indoor fundraiser was March 9th, Maya Wiley and Ray McGuire pointing out they haven't had any indoor fundraisers, Diane Morales canceled her latest indoor fundraising event, and Carlos Menchaca saying he's been sticking to the virtual world to raise money. Rumors are flying that former Bloomberg Deputy Mayor Christine Quinn is planning another run for mayor after losing in the Democratic primary in 2013. Department of Transportation Commissioner Polly Trottenberg has decided to leave de Blasio's administration, marking a continued trend of Blasio's appointees leaving. Trottenberg has been Transportation Commissioner for the past 7 years, overseeing the Vision Zero program, getting more subway funding from the state, and advocating for more street space for cyclists and pedestrians. A spate of new subway attacks where people are getting pushed onto the train tracks is increasing, or is at least making new headlines in the news. De Blasio said that he was concerned about the increase in shovings and vowed a visible NYPD boost in subway stations. As Inauguration Day shortly approaches, the NYPD is planning for the Secret Service to start scaling back their presence at Trump Tower, as well as their own presence. The city has gone a full 24 hours without a shooting for the first time in months, which was broken shortly after a domestic violence call ended in a CUNY peace officer shooting 2 police officers before getting shot and killed himself. Black Lives Matter protesters demanded that the city fire a corrections officer and their captain after what they say are insufficient actions after discovering the hanging of an inmate, Ryan Wilson, in the Manhattan detention complex known as the Tombs. Moving on to the city council. 11 candidates have filed for paperwork to run to replace Rory Lansman in his council seat, who went on to work for the Cuomo administration. The race will be the first to test out the ranked choice voting system that voters chose to replace the original winner-take-all system. The race is on February 2nd. The Working Families Party issued 8 endorsements this week for City Council, including Marjorie Velasquez against incumbent Mark Gionai and Juan Ardila against incumbent Robert Holden. Other endorsements were Althea Stevens, Adolfo Abreu, Mino Laura, Felicia Singh, Alita Gagarin, and Lincoln Ressler. Moving on to Cuomo. For all of Cuomo's announcements of restrictions forbidding New Yorkers to do this or that, Cuomo said this week that he will be having Thanksgiving with his grandmother. It took all of 2 hours for the governor to take that back, realizing the political blowback that would get. Cuomo later said that the state is nearing towards 12 to 20% COVID rates if New Yorkers don't heed warnings, and came after sheriffs who said they wouldn't be enforcing the 10-person limit in private homes ahead of Thanksgiving, saying that the limits aren't a political situation. As of the time of this recording, the state's positive testing rate is 3.72%, with nearly 8,200 people testing positive. The Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce pleaded with Cuomo not to put in new restrictions, saying businesses won't survive another round of closures. Cuomo reacted to the Supreme Court ruling after they ruled his earlier red zone regulations against places of worship were unconstitutional, saying that this is an indication of what side the court leans on now with Barrett's appointment, and calling their opinion irrelevant since the regulations aren't in place anymore.
The zone that they were talking about has already been moot. It expired last week. So I think this was really just an opportunity for the court to express its philosophy and politics. It doesn't have any practical effect.
We go over the ruling in more detail in a bit. Western New York is increasingly being seen as the hotbed for COVID infections, with 1,500 calls to the state's hotline in a 24-hour period, according to Erie County. New York City schools aren't the only ones that closed, as Long Island decided to close up its schools beginning this upcoming Monday. As the state's financial problems pile up, hope is being held out for a fiscal stimulus from the government once Biden sits in the White House. The state had instituted a harsh hiring freeze throughout all of its agencies, as spurred by a memo from State Budget Director Robert Mujica, yet Cuomo hired 4 people in his office, totaling around $567,000 in salaries. Cuomo called on New York City mayoral hopefuls to set a higher standard after reports of Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams holding fundraisers in risky places, flouting COVID restrictions. A Times Union analysis showed that a white inmate in New York is more likely to get parole than a black or Hispanic inmate, and the gap is getting widened as the years go by. 5% of the state's prison population tested positive for corona, yet medical pardons are still rare, and Cuomo has used his pardons sparingly, according to The Gothamist. Even Norman Seabrook, the convicted former jail's union head, asked the court to change his prison term to home confinement because he's afraid of contracting COVID. The Partnership for Public Good released a report finding that reducing solitary confinement could save the state $132 million a year over the next decade. Attorney General Letitia James accused the Roman Catholic Buffalo Diocese of covering up years of sexual abuse by priests, violating state and church law. James also released a report saying that most donations that go to nonprofits actually end up going into the hands of professional fundraising companies, and 31% of 824 charities studied, fundraisers kept more than half of the cash that was raised. A new salvo was launched following a report that Cuomo praised about the need for a Gateway Tunnel, a proposed new rail project under the Hudson River that will cost $13 billion. The head of Amtrak and Jersey politicians are questioning the report's findings, but Jersey's governor and senators are pushing for the project to move forward. Trump was against the project, but with Biden coming into office, it looks favorable this time around. The Port Authority released a $7.3 billion budget proposal for next year, cutting 626 jobs and allocating $1.2 billion less for capital improvements. The head of the International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers wrote a letter to MTA Chairman Pat Foy to cut its so-called transformation team instead of laying off 9,000 workers. The transformation team is meant to find efficiencies in the MTA. Moving on to Albany. Democratic State Senate Speaker Andrea Stewart Cousins announced the majority to have gained a supermajority of seats over Republicans, with at least 42 seats controlled by Democrats. The Democratic Socialists of America are setting their sights on State Senator Liz Krueger, saying the Upper East Side representative hasn't raised taxes on the wealthy in her district. Democratic State Senator Jen Metzger conceded to her Republican opponent Mike Martucci for the 42nd Senate District, representing Sullivan, Orange, Ulster, and Delaware counties. Metzger's concession stopped the impending court battle over the seat. In a reversal of Metzger's situation, Democratic Senator Pete Harcum declared victory over Republican Rob Astorino to continue representing the 40th Senate District, representing Westchester, Putnam, and Dutchess counties. Harcum's victory guaranteed the Democrat supermajority in the Senate chamber, giving them 42 out of the 63 available seats. Moving on to the state courts. The New York Court of Appeals has ruled that the rezoning of parts of the Inwood neighborhood in Manhattan can move forward after declining to allow a hearing from opponents of the plan. The trial-level court voided the rezoning, but then the appellate Supreme Court greenlighted the plan. The plan seeks to create or preserve 4,100 affordable housing units by 2032 and will bring in $200 million in investment. Opponents of the rezoning point to the usual side effects of rezoning plans, including gentrification and increased prices in the neighborhood. This past summer, the city council lost a court case fighting against approving a development of 4 towers in Lower Manhattan, saying that the development didn't go through the arduous city council review process, with only the city planning commission greenlighting the plan. The appellate division ruled in favor of the developer, saying that the evidence showed the development went through a public hearing process under New York law. The city council and Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer plan to appeal the ruling straight to the Court of Appeals, the state's highest court level. After a state trial court gave New York City the right to decide where it would be able to house its homeless population, Lower Manhattan residents are set to file an appeal to that decision, not wanting 200 single homeless men that were moved from the Upper West Side Lucerne Hotel to Wall Street's Radisson Hotel. Moving on to Trump. Trump has finally sent the Biden transition team a message that the administration is ready to start the transition process, freeing up funds and office space for Biden's people. Trump only sent his letter of ascertainment once Michigan certified their election results, defying fears that there would be a deadlock from state Republicans. Pennsylvania and Nevada certified Biden's victory in those states shortly afterwards during the week. Trump was also facing an avalanche of overwhelming opposition from business leaders and a small plurality of Republicans that, citing no election fraud evidence, encouraged the president to begin the transition. Despite the transition finally being allowed to officially occur, a memo by Trump's chief of staff Mark Meadows says that workers from the office of the president aren't permitted to speak directly with Biden's transition, and Trump himself still refuses to concede. Usually after presidents retire, they're still protected by the Secret Service, albeit at a very pared-down rate. ABC reports that Secret Service members were asked about protecting Trump full-time at his resort in Palm Beach, Florida. Trump held something of a press conference at the White House this week, still falsely saying that he won the election by overwhelming numbers and repeated lies about voter fraud, despite his lawsuits being dismissed everywhere in the country. He said that the Electoral College certifying Biden's win in the near future would be a mistake, wouldn't say if he would show up at Biden's inauguration, but said that he would of course leave the White House if Biden won, which he did. Trump had a small moment where he blew up on a reporter, saying no one should talk to the president, quote, that way, after the reporter asked numerous questions.
If the Electoral College votes for Joe Biden on December 14th, will you concede the election?
It's going to be a very hard thing to concede because we know there was massive fraud. So as to whether or not I can get this apparatus moving this quickly, because time isn't on our side. Everything else is on our side. Facts are on our side. This was a massive fraud. This should never take place in this country. We're like a third world country. We have machines that nobody knows what the hell they're looking at. I think it's a possibility. They're trying to look between you people. Don't talk to me that way. You're just a lightweight. Don't talk to me that way. I'm the president of the United States. Don't ever talk to the president that way. All right, I'm going to go with another question.
Biden has named major names this week for his future cabinet positions. Keep in mind, these people need to be confirmed by the Senate, and if Republicans maintain control of the chamber, things can get difficult for Biden's ability to choose whoever he wants to work for him. Anthony Blinken was chosen by Biden to be the next Secretary of State, a very lucrative position. Blinken is Biden's longtime aide, serving as the former Deputy National Security Advisor and staff director for Biden when he was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Jake Sullivan was also chosen as the future National Security Advisor, who formerly advised Hillary Clinton on national security matters as well. Linda Thomas Greenfield was chosen as the nation's next UN ambassador. For the post of Director of National Intelligence, Biden chose the first woman to fill the seat in Avril Haines, and Biden also chose the first Latino Jewish person, Alejandra Mayorkas, to lead the Department of Homeland Security. John Kerry, former presidential candidate, has been chosen to be the envoy on the environment, focusing on climate change as an existential threat. Janet Yellen, who was previously in charge of the Federal Reserve under Obama, will become the first woman to head the Treasury Department. The Dow Jones Industrial Average reached 30,000 for the first time following Yellen's announcement. Now, for all of the relief people might be feeling watching Biden choose otherwise qualified individuals for his future cabinet, Politico's Ryan Lizza reported that it's not all sunshine and rainbows in Biden land, with members of Biden's campaign and former Hillary Clinton staffers afraid that former Obama staffers might gobble up all of the open federal jobs. Reporting by The Hill also showed that progressives weren't happy with Biden's pick to head the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, Bridget C.E. Dooling, because of her past role at the George Washington Regulatory Studies Center, which has received funding from the conservative Charles Koch Foundation and ExxonMobil, as well as the Studies Center being sympathetic to Trump's deregulatory agenda. The president-elect started getting daily intelligence briefings starting Wednesday since the Trump administration ascertained Biden as the victor of the presidential election. AstraZeneca released their COVID vaccine effectiveness numbers, revealing their tests show only 70% effectiveness. The FDA granted emergency approval to the antibody cocktail Regeneron created, the same one that Trump took when he got sick with coronavirus. The CDC revealed the results of their study about suicide in young adults, showing that 1 in 4 respondents said they did think about killing themselves in the past 30 days, underscoring the pandemic's effect on loneliness. The CDC is also finalizing a report that says those who believe they've been infected by someone afflicted with COVID need not quarantine for 2 weeks, but just 7 to 10 days, followed by a test afterwards in order to get better results with public compliance. The White House is still planning on having indoor holiday parties despite rising infection numbers. With news of various vaccine trials knowing their levels of effectiveness, attention is being paid to the difficult logistics challenge of spreading the vaccine to hundreds of millions of Americans. While that's figured out, scrutiny continues to be paid on the PPP program that was meant to save struggling businesses, but instead, in one case, sold titles to those loans at 350% of the annual rate of the original loan. The White House is considering lifting the European travel restrictions put in place once it was realized the majority of COVID cases earlier on were coming from Europe. Timing on the decision remains vague, but it continues a trend that certain critics say Trump is doing on purpose in order to make Biden's job more difficult once he's in position. The weekly labor report revealed that jobless claims rose to 778,000 as infection numbers rose, and it was an increase of 40,000 from last week. There were only 225,000 before the pandemic kicked off the ground, and 2 unemployment programs will expire the day after Christmas, affecting 9.1 million people. Moody's Analytics reported that if Biden was allowed to pass his full economic agenda, the economy could be at full employment by the second half of 2022, but a divided Congress won't make that a reality. Michael Flynn, the former lieutenant general and national security advisor who is facing time in prison for allegedly committing perjury in court and lying to the FBI, was pardoned by Donald Trump. Trump has pardoned or commuted the sentences of many of his close aides, except for certain notable cases like former personal lawyer Michael Cohen and former campaign chairman Paul Manafort. In all, there are 8 of the president's old associates that were either charged or convicted with crimes generally, and special counsel Mueller's probe charged many more. Shortly after Pompeo visited Israel on his international farewell tour, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu traveled with the Secretary of State for a meeting with Saudi Arabian officials, a high-level meeting out in public which is usually held in secret. Unfortunately, the meeting between the two countries failed to come up with a normalization agreement so quickly. The Wall Street Journal's Bob Davis reported that the Trump administration is trying to figure out new hard measures to take against China, increasing a ban on imports and adding Chinese companies to blacklists. Back in September and November of last year, California tried going around the Trump administration and setting the strictest carbon emissions policies in the nation, forcing the 5 major car companies to revamp their own production standards. Trump's response was to force the EPA to nationalize fuel emission standards, loosening them in the process, making it costly for auto companies to follow the California rules. Debate within the automotive companies made them switch back to adopting tougher emissions rules, and news broke this week that General Motors dropped its support for Trump's lawsuit against California's fuel economy standards, saying the company is ready to work with the future Biden administration. Continuing the Trump administration's trend of pulling out of almost every national treaty the U.S. is a part of till the very end, Trump pulled back from the Open Skies Treaty, specifically with Russia, an agreement between 34 nations allowing for unarmed aerial flights over each party's nation. After reporting last week that showed the census might not complete its final population count before Trump is out of office, texts received by the Associated Press show that the U.S. Census manager told counters to use fake answers to mark households as only having one resident if they don't know how many people actually live there, after failing to score an interview with the household after 2 tries, among a background of the Trump administration wanting to end the counting early. Continuing the long tradition of pardoning turkeys ahead of Thanksgiving, Trump forgave 2 turkeys, Corn and Cobb, to live out their days on a farm instead of joining millions of other turkeys that ultimately end up on dinner tables all around the country.
Corn, I hereby grant you a full pardon. Thank you, Corn. What a great.
On behalf of the entire Trump family, I want to wish every American a healthy and very happy Thanksgiving. We're here today to continue a beloved annual tradition, the official presidential pardon of a very, very fortunate turkey. For the past 73 years, the National Turkey Federation has presented the national Thanksgiving turkey to the president, starting under President George H.W. Bush. These birds have received a formal pardon every single year. Today is my honor to present to you this year's lucky bird, Corn, and just in case we needed him, Cobb. Corn and Cobb. That's not too hard to remember, is it? During this Thanksgiving, we extend our eternal gratitude to the doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, and scientists who have waged the battle against the China virus, and we give thanks for the vaccines and therapies that will soon end the pandemic.
Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Thank you very much.
Biden came out with his own Thanksgiving speech, calling on the nation to unite against the pandemic, heeding warnings not to fight with one another.
That out of pain comes possibility. Out of frustration comes progress. And out of division, unity. You all know in our finest hours, that's who we've always been. And that's who we shall be again. For I believe that this grim season of division, demonization, is going to give way to a year of light and of unity. Why do I think so? Because America is a nation not of adversaries, but of neighbors. Not of limitations, but of possibilities. Not of dreams deferred, but of dreams realized. I've said many times that this is a great country. We are a good people. This is the United States of America. And there's never been anything we've been unable to do when we've done it together. Think of what we come through as a nation. How many things we've come through? Centuries of human enslavement, cataclysmic civil war, exclusion of women from the battle box, world wars, Jim Crow, the long twilight struggle against Soviet tyranny that could have ended not in the fall of the Berlin Wall, but in nuclear Armageddon. Look, I'm not naive. I know that history is just that, history. But to know what came before, what's come before, what's happened before, can help arm us against despair.
$200 million that was promised to be used to fight back against the U.S. opioid crisis is largely unused, a result of all of the lawyers who sued Purdue Pharma not agreeing on how the money should be spent. Meanwhile, Purdue Pharma finally pled guilty on 3 criminal charges connected to the opioid epidemic it largely fueled. The deal included $8.3 billion in penalties and forfeitures. The Sackler family, however, which is largely in charge of Purdue, is going to be largely untouched. Moving on to the Congress and starting in the House. The race for who will be the next congressman for the 22nd New York Congressional District is still being decided in courts and behind closed doors as lawyers plan out how to win hundreds of votes that can tip the balance of the race. 39 absentee ballots might control the fate of the race, as election officials admitted in court they lost sticky notes attached to those ballots explaining how those ballots were handled and whether they were counted according to the Post Standard. Oswego County Supreme Court Justice Scott Del Conte issued an injunction against the county certification of the race on Wednesday, only furthering a delay in the case. Brindisi later said that he began leading Tenney by 100 to 300 votes. House Democrats are divided on the issue of renaming Confederate bases in the upcoming defense bill. Trump has threatened to veto a bill that would rename Confederate bases, saying Democrats are trying to erase American history. Rep. Stephen Palazzo was the source of a profile by Mississippi Today, looking into his campaign account and positing whether it was being used as a slush fund, spending thousands of dollars on meals in expensive restaurants, hotel rooms, entertainment, and golfing. In the Senate, For his 70th birthday, Democratic Senate leader Chuck Schumer completed another tradition of visiting every New York county. California Governor Gavin Newsom has to decide who he is going to choose to replace Kamala Harris in the Senate, with activists pressuring the Democrat to choose another woman of color, seeing as Harris was the second black woman in the chamber in history. Longtime Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein is stepping down in her role as ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Feinstein has faced numerous outcries from progressive Democrats saying that she continued making gaffes and doesn't forcefully represent the interests of the younger members of the party, as shown through the Barrett confirmation hearings. Senator Perdue, one of the senators running to keep his seat in the upcoming Georgia runoff elections in January, is the subject of a report by the Associated Press on the senator's stock practices right before anyone knew the pandemic was underway. Perdue shorted stocks in the company Cardlytics, an advertising platform, and bought back the stock when it was valued less. Cardlytics stock quadrupled in price, with experts questioning the timing of Purdue's stock purchase. In the judicial branch, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4, largely along ideological grounds, against New York State, when it said the state unconstitutionally infringed on the religious rights of the Brooklyn Archdiocese and the Jewish Agudath Israel, two houses of worship affected by Cuomo's red zone regulations that limited the number of people allowed to congregate inside churches, synagogues, and similar places to 10 to 25 people at a time. The case was ruled the other way in favor of New York when Ginsburg was alive, but this time, even with Roberts dissenting with the liberals, Barrett's appointment to the court switched things back to the religious party's side. New York had argued that the case was moot anyway since the regulations weren't in place anymore, but the court's ruling makes it impossible for the state to return to those regulations if COVID numbers make things worse and puts everyone back in red zones again. Chief Justice Roberts in his dissent said Cuomo, quote, might reinstate the restrictions, but he also might not, and that it's a, quote, significant matter to override determinations made by public health officials. The majority opinion, although unsigned, features an opinion from Trump appointee Neil Gorsuch, who wrote, quote, it is time, past time, to make plain that while the pandemic poses many grave challenges, there is no world in which the Constitution tolerates color-coded executive edicts that reopen liquor stores and bike shops, but shutter churches, synagogues, and mosques. His other colleagues in the majority were less scathing in their opinions on the New York regulations. After having his federal case in Pennsylvania dismissed, Trump filed an appeal with the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which swiftly dismissed the Trump campaign's claims of voting irregularities again, since Giuliani argued that it wasn't a fraud case, with Trump appointee Judge Stefanos Bibas delivering a scathing opinion excoriating Trump's team for bringing claims of fraud without evidence. Nevertheless, Trump's legal team said there was corruption going on in the courts and vowed to appeal to the Supreme Court. The campaign cut lawyer Sidney Powell after she made ludicrous unfounded claims that election systems were purposely sabotaged by governors that were paid off to give Biden an edge in the vote count. Powell filed a lawsuit independently that made the same claims without evidence. We reported last time that the federal grand jury was brought together to investigate claims of fraud in Buffalo Mayor Byron Brown's administration. A waste disposal business CEO testified before that grand jury this week about the city's contracts. A federal class action lawsuit was filed by Advocates for Children, alleging that New York City hasn't delivered on its obligations to provide special education students in education amidst challenges in remote learning, as well as providing electronic devices such as iPads and laptops. Parents filed 11,000 complaints in the 2019-20 school year. The Legal Aid Society filed a case in Manhattan federal court against the Blasio administration to force the city to provide internet at all family homeless shelters so that homeless students can effectively learn remotely. 25,000 homeless students scarcely have reliable broadband internet in shelters. The law department said the city already has a plan to provide homeless students more reliable internet. An analysis by the federal defenders of New York revealed that Manhattan federal prosecutors used predominantly white jurors in Westchester for indictments instead of presenting the cases to a diverse panel from the city, leading to disproportionate criminal case results during the pandemic. Moving on to national news, the U.S. has reached the unfortunate milestone of 13 million infections, and the country hit 90,000 hospitalizations for the first time. 205,000 cases were reported on Friday alone after Thanksgiving. California Governor Newsom is quarantining for 2 weeks after his kids came in contact with an infected police officer. The New York Times reported that evidence is building to support the premise that an early mutation of COVID made the pandemic harder to stop, infecting people more easily and allowing COVID to spread almost effortlessly. Thanksgiving was a make-or-break moment for America to make sure the pandemic doesn't spread even more, with new state restrictions really emphasizing the need for families to stay home this holiday season instead of traveling so much as they traditionally do so. But hopes for that are tamping down, as TSA officials had already logged 3 million airport travelers. Assuming Pfizer's vaccine gets FDA emergency authorization, states may receive almost 6.4 million vaccines by mid-December. 6 American oil executives were tried and found guilty in Venezuela for corruption, sentencing them from 8 to 13 years. The Citgo executives arrived in Venezuela 3 years ago after getting calls for a business meeting, but were arrested instead. That's it for this week's show on the 25th Hour, helping you beat the 24/7 news cycle every Sunday afternoon. I ask that you please rate, subscribe, and share this podcast to your friends. And don't forget to become a patron today at patreon.com/the25thhournews. As always, you can email your tips and suggestions at the25thhournews@gmail.com. Follow us on most of your social media platforms and spread New York City's soon-to-be top-rated political podcast. Thank you, and have a great rest of your weekend.